Hello, welcome back, AP Environmental Science students. Mr. Harrison here. We're going to be doing Ed Puzzle 10. We're going to be talking about carrying capacities and population growth and resource availability. I've decided to add age structure diagrams, etc., to all having to do with human populations as your final Ed Puzzle. So remember, we're going to be doing some data analysis skills throughout, and this is no different. So for 3.4 carrying capacity. And again, here's another place where we use another letter to represent C. We use K for carrying capacity. You can see by this graph that we're going to be looking at graphs quite a bit in this example. We're going to describe carrying capacity. Our data analysis explain what the data implies or illustrates about the environmental issue. We're going to describe the impact of carrying capacity on ecosystems. So those are our learning objectives, essential knowledge you can read yourself. So carrying capacity is the max number of individuals in a population that an ecosystem can support based on the limiting resources. So familiarize yourself with this figure 1, which represents population size over time. You can see that we have exponential growth going on here, and then logistic growth. Eventually, the population hits a carrying capacity and falls to zero. So this is a theoretical model. In actuality, most populations do this. They expand, they overshoot their carrying capacity. There's a rapid die-off. And eventually, the population will begin to stabilize as it gets at a number that is realistic for that carrying capacity. All right, so again, highest population ecosystem can support based on those limiting resources: food, water, habitat. And overshoot is when a population briefly exceeds. Real common with deer populations. They'll reproduce excessively in the fall and in the spring, and then there'll be a spike in the population. Cold winter comes along and knocks down those populations. When populations do overshoot, oftentimes there's a consequence. In the case of deer, they'll browse pretty much or overgraze all their available food sources, and there'll be a die-off. So a die-off is a sharp decrease in population size. When they when a species either overexploits the food, water, habitat. So example, again, too many deer will cause too many new fawns feeding in the spring will cause a rapid die-off. So here's an example that actually occurred in Alaska. There were 25 reindeer introduced to this island not far from the Kodiak Islands. And the growth rate you see was gradual and then exponential. And then obviously overshooting of the carrying capacity, and then a rapid drop as the population had no food. They ate all the lichen on the island. And this does happen when there's a limited resource and the population cannot move. So real populations don't always fluctuate. Sometimes they do crash. Predator-prey relationships are great places to see populations in action. Here's a model of a hare population going up and down because of lynx, and lynx are a kind of a bobcat that specializes on them. And you can see the lynx populations fluctuate pretty much in sync with the hare populations. And I'm sure the correlation coefficient is pretty tight. Increasing lynx population limit hare populations, which eventually will cause the hare to decrease. Here's another example I'm going to be talking about having to do with wolves. So here's a practice. What I'd like you to do is take a look at this graph that has to do with predator-prey relationships. I believe this might be on Isle Royale. If you've ever been up into northern UP, Michigan, or up in Duluth, Minnesota, you can access a pretty cool spot. I recommend taking a boat ride sometime to the National Park Isle Royale, where they have done extensive research on wolves and moose populations, which are kind of isolated on that island. So explain the impact the canine virus had on the moose population based on the graph. Good luck. All right, 3.5, population growth and resource availability. So we're going to explain how resource availability affects population growth. You can read the essential knowledge. We're going to, again, be working on our math skills and doing some calculations having to do with populations. So very important terms to know about populations. When we talk about size of the population, we use N, the total number of individuals in a given area. Usually, the larger the population is, the safer it is from population decline. Density is the number of individuals in a given area. An example here would be 12 panthers in a square kilometer. High density means higher competition, possibly more disease outbreak, and depleting that resource. Distribution is the term we use to describe how individuals in a population are spaced out. You can see the three examples here on the right. We have random distribution. These are the fall colors you can see up in northern Wisconsin, where you have a mix of different hardwoods kind of randomly scattered throughout with some evergreens. Uniform distribution looks like some nesting birds where they're establishing nesting areas pretty uniformly, or clump distribution where populations are concentrated in given areas, as in this case of the meerkats. All right. So other things we are important to note are sex ratios, the ratios of males to females to understand populations. If there's a die-off or bottleneck effect which skews that sex ratio, if there's not enough females, for example, that can severely limit the population growth. Density dependent factors. What are those? Those are the factors that influence a population growth based on the size. So the more individuals in that given area, there'll be more competition for habitat, for food, for light, and there'll be more diseases. All of these things can limit population growth based on their size. Density independent factors. So what are those? Density independent means these are things that are not influenced by how many individuals there are in a given area. Examples are natural disasters such as flood, hurricane, tornado. And it doesn't matter how big or small a population is, natural disasters will limit the population growth, as this poor kitty is finding out. Okay, here's an example of density-dependent factors. This is a lab experiment with paramecium. Paramecium are small little protists. Protists are a cool group of organisms that are kind of animal-like and plant-like. And you can see under low food conditions, the populations of two different species grew rapidly at first and then reached their carrying capacity. When food was added, it's a density dependent factor. When it produced twice as much, when twice as much food was added to the dish, both species increased the carrying capacity about twice as much. So that's an example of a density dependent variable. All right, here are a couple more graphs, and we talked briefly about this before, but biotic potential is the max potential growth rate of a population or cohort with no limiting resources. And may occur initially, but limited resources are always there, which slow the growth rate and eventually limit the population. Here is environmental resistance, and what that produces in contrast to exponential growth is logistic growth. That's when there's initially a rapid growth rate, and then those limiting factors start to reduce that population and it plateaus at that carrying capacity, or it overshoots and then comes back down. So logistic growth versus exponential growth. Right, we're going to do some calculations of population, and what determines a population size are, of course, births, also immigration. So immigration is when individuals move from one area to another into that population, and population is decreased by those deaths and those immigration, so that individuals that leave that population. Here's an example. An elk population has 52 elk, has 19 births and 6 deaths in a season, and 5 elk immigrate to the herd and 0 elk emigrate from the herd. So what is the population size? So how would you calculate this? First, you want to add your positives, which would be the birth rates, 19 plus the immigration subtracted by the deaths, and the immigration gives you a number of 70 elk. Were you right? Okay, now I want you to do a calculation. Calculate the population size of a 14 wolf pack that experiences 5 deaths, 3 births, and 4 new wolves released into the pack from a nearby wildlife sanctuary. This is mathematical routines.